Okay, we started out with thinking about the idea of ambiguity with uh, Keanu Reeves and with Tiger Woods, and now we're going to move to the third chapter in Nishime's text, which deals with Grace Park and the character she plays on Battlestar Galactica, excuse me. But we want to back up a little bit and really think about, well, where does this come from in terms of the idea of robots? And in reality, robots are really kind of springing from this early 20th century, really late 19th century, but early 20th century imagination of what technological advancements can do, right? This is in the sort of aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, but really thinking about, well, what are all these wonderful things that machines have been able to give us, and thinking about, well, then what's the next step for that? And of course, that means robotic technology. And so, Isaac Asimov writes about this in the 1950s with I, Robot, but it's really even something that emerges much earlier than that. But it's always about the idea of how can we do things much more efficiently, how can we make things more efficiently, how can we create all these different products more efficiently, and of course make life easier for humans on Earth. The other reality is to think, well, why do we need to make labor a lot easier? Is primarily because it's built out of this particular anxiety of the inefficiencies that human labor creates, right? It's not just the idea that humans are slower than robots or slower than machines or maybe make more mistakes than machines, but the fact that they also bring up a lot of those particular human anxieties and issues, especially think about immigrant labor, migrant labor, right? They want to get paid, they'll go on strike, they will slow down, they'll stop. And of course, when we think about all the fears of immigration that also emerges in the late 19th, early 20th century in terms of what they might bring. Again, we think about that idea of the yellow peril. This kind of all wraps up together. So the easiest way to sort of, maybe stop that is to go to a different form of labor. And of course, the reality is that this is something that's always going to be imagined. Even as you can see, right? Even though Asimov's writing in the 1950s, it's not something that just starts with him. You actually have someone like Fritz Lang, who is a German impressionist filmmaker in 1927, created the movie Metropolis, where it is again the narrative is that you have a factory that creates this particular robot, and they give the robot human features, and it goes into the worker's nest and stirs up all this discontent. So it's the idea that how can you use robots for to sow discontent, but also to cause harm, to basically be the enemy of mankind. And this is something that starts off that because, of course, with Metropolis, it's the idea that the machine itself is actually going to destroy humanity. And of course, this then emerges in terms of, again, further and further we go into the 1950s, 1960s, and into the present, thinking about the idea of how these ideas of androids, right, robots with human features, or cyborgs, which are actually these hybrids between human and machine, how they become these metaphors for what can happen with immigrant labor, what happens when we incorporate them into everyday life, and the fact that we can't tell who they are, the difference between the android and the human, or the cyborg and the human, is really the start of the downfall of society. Right? And we can think about this with killer robots like HAL 9000, right? But of course, even before HAL 9000 and Space Odyssey 2001, Arthur C. Clarke's novel and film, you have someone like Robbie the Robot from a show like Lost in Space, which is, again, you have a robot that's there primarily as an assistant, but that can be programmed to go berserk and attack humans, right? And so this is where you get the idea of destroy. But of course, the more immediate one is we think about 2001, right? The idea that HAL is designed to fulfill the mission, and that in fulfilling the mission, that is his entire purpose, so much so as that he will then sort of continue on with the mission with disregard to the human life that's aboard the ship in 2001. And of course, then this will then evolve with the idea of, well, how else can robots or machines kill us? And of course, this is the classic one when we think about Arnold Schwarzenegger, and how Arnold Schwarzenegger gets his real fame is with the Terminator films. The idea that you have not only a machine that is designed to kill, but designed specifically to kill and eliminate humans because of this revolution of machines against humanity, and that they are in fact unstoppable. Right? Once they get their mission in their head, that they cannot be stopped. So robots are inherently a threat to humanity in these particular narratives. It's primarily because they are created initially for, the benefit of mankind, but that they turn on mankind. That's kind of the anxiety. You can think about how that anxiety also then, is then roped into or kind of gathered into the idea of immigrant labor. Right? They're supposed to help us, and yet they turn in and turn against us. This becomes even more problematic when we think about the idea of cyborgs. Remember, the idea of cyborgs are different from androids or regular robots, right? Because they don't just look human. The idea of the cyborg is that they, in fact, are part human, right? They incorporate not only human DNA, but sometimes will take on human, personalities, human foibles as well. This is first introduced really in terms of cinema in something like the Blade Runner film from 1982. They're doing a remake of that, where you have the highest level of these particular, these cyborgs. They're known as replicants in the movie Blade Runner, but then they sort of get conscious of their own mortality and desire to return to Earth because their desires to find out why they have such a limited lifespan. Again, the idea that now cyborgs, right, these replicants are then kind of dealing with and sort of struggling with the issues of their own humanity. And of course, it's set in a futuristic America. Right? Oddly enough, the inception date, as you can see, for the Priss model is to 26 February 2016, and Blade Runner is actually set in 2021 of Los Angeles. So we're only 5 years away from Blade Runner, if you think about it that way. More recently, you have someone like Steven Spielberg doing the movie AI, Artificial Intelligence, which really retakes the Pinocchio story, right? The idea of the puppet who wants to become a boy, and uses that as a way of sort of roping into the idea of a more futuristic narrative about cyborgs, about creating these particular forms of artificial intelligence, the idea that you can create a boy who wants to actually be a human and sort of has all the love for his mother. But of course, when the mother has to sort of realize that that's something she is uncomfortable with, because the robot itself is not really human and can't die in that same way. So the idea of mortality, that particular anxiety, also builds up into it. And so this is Spielberg's delving into it. And even more recently, you have Ex Machina, which came out in 2015, which deals with the idea of creating this idea of a totally, seamless, imperceptible difference between machinery and humanity. Again, the idea that it's taking on all these particular human features. And this is one of those moves that built upon this idea, the Turing test, the idea of how can you actually decide whether or not, through a series of questions, whether the respondent is actually a human being or is it simply just a computer, it's an artificial intelligence. And so, again, this is a more recent version of this particular idea of how can cyborgs maybe replace humans down the line, right? And oddly enough, one of the things we want to think about with Battlestar Galactica is, if you think about the first example for Blade Runner and with Ex Machina, that part of the narrative that goes along with those particular cyborgs is how they're not just replacement labor in terms of physical labor, in terms of building things, but they're also in many ways thought of as replacement labor for sex work. And that also kind of ties into the character that's built up in Battlestar Galactica, the idea that you can build machines for pleasure. And so there's all of these kinds of other anxieties that go along with it. I will say that, again, these are just more recent examples. If you go back early into the 1960s, you have a movie like Westworld, which is being remade for HBO, which is the idea of these theme parks that are built around cyborgs that are that are there for humans to visit and then experience these particular fantasies played out, and they're done because, and they're seen as harmless because they're interacting not with real human beings but with robots, and what happens when the robots become sentient or malfunction. Which brings us to the final point of Battlestar Galactica. Now remember that this is the more recent version of Battlestar Galactica. They are actually talking about rebooting Battlestar Galactica once again into a series of movies. And this is actually not the first one, because obviously the first Battlestar Galactica was from the 1970s and 1980s, where you just had the Cylons. And the narrative of the Cylons was really just the idea that this was a robot force that was there generated to destroy humanity, and humanity has to search for a safe haven, which was Earth. they take that particular narrative from the 1970s, 1980s, and then revise it a little bit more into the newer version from 2004, where the idea that Cylons are actually these creations, get created by humans, and that turn against the humans and sort of desire for this idea of elimination. But of course, what they also do is they realize is that part of the process that's different from Battlestar Galactica from 1970s to the more recent version is that the Cylons themselves are not just the machines that you see here in the center, but they're also incorporating the idea of, again, cyborgs that take on human features, and that they are clones of the same particular model. And so the narrative of Battlestar Galactica is that there are 12 models, actually 13 models, but only 12 models that actually were seen, that are trying to cope with the notion of their own humanity, their own existence, and the idea of God, and all these other spiritual ideas, but also in terms of fighting against humanity, who they see as the lesser form, or the less developed form of existence. And so this is really what Nishimei is trying to get us to see, is to think about how does this particular narrative, especially think about Grace Park and her character of Athena and Boomer and all the other iterations that they play, how do they then emerge as this particular narrative for being, again, this kind of sort of undercover agent, this undercover human in a futuristic world. But the other side of it is that, again, one of the characters that's sort of literally birthed from this from the Athena character is the character of Hera, which is not only a multiracial child in terms of being born from an Asian appearing woman or an Asian American woman, although in this particular universe there is no such thing as Asian, and a white or Caucasian male. So in that particular narrative, or in our particular narrative, we would understand it as a biracial child, but it's also biracial in terms of the idea that it is a hybrid between, or a child that is born of a human parent and a Cylon parent. It's the only child in existence in this particular universe. So this idea of Hera is, how does Hera actually represent this particular metaphor, this narrative of multiraciality? Is she, because of this unique birth, a miracle child? Is she something that stands out? Of course, we think about all these other narratives that then emerge from that particular possibility, and the reality is that they can't develop it enough. They can't actually figure out what to do with the Hera character, which is something that Nishimei points out. But it does present these interesting problems and interesting questions about the future of humanity and the future of Cylon, and the idea of coexistence between these two literally different species, but then the idea that maybe they are simply different elements of the same DNA. And this is what we want to think about as we're reading Nishimei's chapter and think about Battlestar Galactica, is how much does it actually rely upon these narratives of race and integration and immigration, but also the fact that these are perceived as internalized threats for the larger community. So that's what we want to do for this particular, to really think about how this particular set of chapters is, well, how do we deal with the ambiguity of multiraciality, especially when it comes to Asian Pacific Americans. So there are 2 discussion questions that you need to address for this week. And again, these are going to be reposted on the discussion board. So the first thing we want to think about is, again, sort of the idea of visibility for Asian Pacific American actors, actresses on mainstream American television. So how important do you think it is? And really do your best to try to evaluate that. Is it something that you think is significant? Why do you think it's significant? Really try to develop that particular question. And remember, the key is to address the question not towards actors who get their start, and really the idea that you have these crossover actors, right? So it's not just the idea that Jackie Chan can become famous here, or Bruce Lee's coming up. Unusual case, although he's born in the United States, he really does get his fame in Hong Kong before he comes back to the United States. But other actors who really establish themselves in their home nations in Asia before crossing over and becoming famous in the United States. Really think about the idea, well, how important is it for actors who really do get their start in the United States to become part of this mainstream television cinema universe, and the idea that that's really going to be important for American culture going forward. Is it something that people need to be concerned about? Second question, and this is really, again, going back to the idea of ambiguity and invisibility, particularly when we think about the ideas of who embraces or who doesn't embrace their multiracial identity, is thinking about, well, is it important for those particular actors when they do appear on screen to actually visibly be Asian Pacific American, right? Are they people that should be, sort of celebrate their heritage in specific ways, or even subtle ways, right? The idea that they're not denying or kind of erasing their particular Asian heritage, especially those who are multiracial. Or as it is, someone like Dean Kane to be living in that Asian American closet where the ethnicity is something that is not only not discussed, it's not, it's downplayed, it's sort of not even there. It's sort of that I'm just an actor, I'm not really, Asian American. So the question is, which do you think is actually more important in terms of, for these different actors? And really, again, trying to address the question in a lot more depth and thinking about, well, and pull out specific actors that you think, okay, that's an example of someone who really is, trying to, embrace their Asian Pacific American heritage or identity versus someone who perhaps isn't. So that's it for this week in terms of discussion questions for the lectures. So don't forget, post the discussion board questions and also take the quiz for week 6. Remember that you should be reading part 1 of Nishime's book, which is chapters 2, 3, and 4. And next week when we go to part 2, or finishing up Nishime's text, we're also going to start thinking about the next paper assignment that's coming up. That's it.